Ethan Miller was a 24-year-old college student drowning in debt. His shoes were worn, his stomach often empty, and his dreams of finishing his engineering degree were slipping further away with each unpaid tuition notice. Every day, he juggled 3 part-time jobs, delivering food, cleaning tables, and tutoring high school kids, yet it still wasn't enough. One rainy afternoon, after being told he'd lose his scholarship, Ethan sat on a park bench, soaked and defeated. That's when he met Margaret Dawson, a 71-year-old woman feeding pigeons beneath a bright red umbrella. Her smile was warm, almost grandmotherly, but her eyes carried stories of loneliness and longing. They began talking, and what started as a casual conversation soon stretched into hours. She listened to his worries with a tenderness that reminded him of his late mother. When she learned he had no family and nowhere to turn, she made a surprising offer, an arrangement that sounded almost absurd. "Marry me," she said softly, "and I'll take care of everything." Ethan froze, thinking she must be joking. But Margaret's voice didn't tremble. She didn't want romance or pity, just companionship in her final years, someone to share laughter, tea, and sunsets with. Torn between disbelief and desperation, Ethan spent sleepless nights thinking about it. Finally, out of gratitude more than greed, he agreed. The next week, in a quiet courthouse, the poor student and the elderly widow said their vows. Cameras clicked, whispers followed, and judgmental eyes watched, but neither of them cared. They only smiled, unaware that this unusual bond would change both their lives forever. At first, Ethan's new life felt surreal. Margaret's home was like a world from another lifetime, filled with antique furniture, books that smelled of history, and the scent of roses drifting through every hallway. She insisted he call her Maggie, saying it made her feel young again. Ethan, awkward at first, didn't know how to act around her. He would quietly help with chores, fix things around the house, and listen as she told stories about her late husband, a kind-hearted doctor who had passed away 10 years earlier. Despite the age gap, they developed a friendship built on laughter and trust. Margaret was witty, sharp, and surprisingly adventurous. She encouraged Ethan to chase his dreams, to never let poverty define him. Slowly, the house that once felt like a stranger's mansion began to feel like home. They started sharing meals together, watching old black and white films, and taking evening walks by the lake behind the property. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a sense of peace. Yet deep inside, guilt gnawed at him. He knew people whispered that he'd married her for money, and sometimes he wondered if they were right. But every time Margaret smiled at him, those thoughts faded away. Her kindness wasn't something he could repay with wealth, it was something that healed him. On the 7th day of their marriage, Margaret woke him early and said she had a surprise planned. Dressed elegantly, with her silver hair tied neatly, she handed him an envelope and told him, "Today, you'll see why life brought us together." Ethan's heart raced with curiosity and fear as they stepped into her car and drove toward an unknown destination that would soon rewrite everything he thought he knew about love, sacrifice, and destiny. The drive took nearly an hour, winding through peaceful countryside roads until they reached a quiet nursing home on the outskirts of town. Margaret's eyes softened as she looked out the window. "This is where I come every week," she whispered. Ethan followed her inside, unsure what to expect. The air smelled faintly of medicine and lavender. In one of the rooms, a young woman sat in a wheelchair, her frail hands trembling as she tried to hold a sketchbook. Margaret approached her gently and touched her shoulder. "Good morning, my sweet Emily," she said. The girl turned, her face lighting up with pure joy. Ethan froze. The young woman looked no older than 25. Margaret turned to him and said quietly, "This is my granddaughter." She explained that Emily had suffered severe brain trauma from a car accident 5 years ago and had since been unable to speak or walk properly. "Doctors said she wouldn't live long," Margaret continued, her voice trembling, "but I couldn't give up on her. I spent everything I had trying to give her a chance." Ethan felt a lump in his throat. He watched as Margaret brushed Emily's hair, speaking to her as if she could still respond. The tenderness in her gestures was overwhelming. Ethan realized that this woman, who had offered him stability, was carrying the unbearable weight of heartbreak. When Emily's eyes met his, she smiled faintly and tried to draw something, a simple picture of three people holding hands under the sun. Ethan's chest tightened. Margaret looked at him then, her voice steady but full of meaning. "Ethan, I wanted you to meet the reason I still believe in kindness." At that moment, he understood, this marriage had never been about saving him, but about saving hope itself. Over the following days, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about Emily. Something about her calm smile and the way she tried to draw despite her trembling hands stayed with him. Margaret often brought him along to the nursing home, and soon Ethan began spending hours there, helping with small tasks, reading stories to Emily, playing soft music, even guiding her hand so she could finish her sketches. Though she couldn't speak, her eyes told him everything. There was gratitude, affection, and a flicker of life returning each day. Margaret would watch them together, her face glowing with quiet joy. "You remind me of my husband," she said one afternoon. "He believed love was the best medicine, and now I see he was right." Ethan, who once thought he'd entered this marriage out of desperation, started to feel something deeper, a purpose he'd never known before. He began researching physical therapy techniques and asked Margaret if he could bring specialists to help Emily improve. She agreed, her heart swelling with pride. Slowly, with time and effort, Emily began responding more, lifting her hands, nodding, even laughing softly. One evening, as the sun painted the sky with shades of gold, Margaret placed her wrinkled hand over Ethan's and whispered, "You've given my granddaughter something no doctor could, hope." Ethan's eyes filled with tears. In that moment, he realized that his journey from poverty had led him not to wealth, but to something far more precious, the chance to change someone's life. Margaret smiled faintly, saying, "Maybe that's why fate brought us together, Ethan, not for me to save you, but for you to save her." Weeks turned into months, and the bond between Ethan, Margaret, and Emily grew into something unbreakable, like a small family stitched together by fate. Margaret's health, however, began to decline. She hid it well, always greeting Ethan with her bright smile, but he noticed how she tired easily, how her hands sometimes shook when she poured her tea. One night, he found her sitting by the window, staring at the moon. "You know," she said softly, "I don't fear leaving anymore. I've seen love bloom again, something I thought I'd lost forever." Ethan sat beside her, speechless. She handed him a sealed envelope, her fingers trembling. "If one day I'm gone, open this," she whispered. Tears filled his eyes as he promised he would. A few weeks later, Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep, her face calm, as if she had just drifted into a dream. The house felt unbearably empty without her laughter echoing through the halls. During the funeral, people whispered again, calling him lucky, a gold digger, even cruel. But Ethan didn't hear them. He stood by her grave, holding the envelope she'd given him, unable to open it yet. Days later, he finally gathered the courage. Inside was a letter written in Margaret's delicate handwriting. It said, "Ethan, I saw goodness in you when the world only saw your struggle. You gave Emily light again, and for that, I leave you everything, not as payment, but as a gift of trust. Promise me you'll keep her smiling." Beneath the letter was a document transferring her entire estate to Ethan and Emily jointly. Ethan broke down, realizing Margaret's final act of love wasn't charity, it was faith in the goodness of the human heart. A year passed, and the old mansion that once felt like a stranger's home was now filled with laughter and warmth again. Ethan had turned part of it into a small art therapy center in Margaret's memory, where patients like Emily could heal through painting, music, and care. Emily, now walking short distances with support, painted a portrait of her grandmother surrounded by sunlight. It hung proudly in the living room. Every corner of the house carried Margaret's presence, the piano she loved, the garden she nurtured, the red umbrella she'd held that rainy day when Ethan first met her. Ethan often sat there, talking to her picture as though she were still listening. "You were right, Maggie," he'd whisper, "love really is the best medicine." Donations began pouring in from people inspired by their story, and soon, the center became a beacon of hope for others who'd lost faith in kindness. Ethan and Emily worked side by side, not as victims of fate but as proof that compassion could rewrite even the saddest chapters. On the anniversary of Margaret's passing, they planted a rose tree by the lake where she used to walk, its blossoms glowing under the sunset. Emily placed her hand on Ethan's and smiled, whispering the first full sentence she'd spoken since her accident, "She'd be proud of us." Ethan nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. For the first time, he truly understood, what began as an act of desperation had blossomed into a legacy of love. Margaret hadn't just changed their lives, she had taught them, and the world, that kindness never dies, it multiplies, passing from one heart to another, forever.